Kia ora koto katoa. I want to begin by acknowledging the people of Rangitane, whose land forms the infrastructure on which this university creates the space for these conversations. It is such a joy to welcome Catherine Delahunty to our 10-year anniversary of CARE and to this conversation in the Activist in Residence program. Welcome, Catherine.
Kia ora, Mohan.
Kia ora. Catherine's activism explores the intersections of extraction, racial capitalism, and settler colonialism, persistently and significantly offering anti-racist registers for the struggles for climate justice. Salient here is her commitment to centering Te Tiriti in climate change conversations. After having founded New Zealand's first secondary school students' union, she went on to work for the Department of Conservation and Greenpeace. A highlight from this time was a toxic site tour of New Zealand, cleaning up contaminated areas. Catherine entered Parliament in 2008. In Parliament, she fought tirelessly for social justice and the environment, recognizing the inextricable links between these causes. She has stood with the people of West Papua and held the government to account for refusing to acknowledge the human rights atrocities that continue there. This internationalism that is at the center of Catherine's work really makes her a vital activist in conversation with CARE, given our work on questions of justice that connect across international registers. Her ongoing work has centered building public pedagogy on Te Tiriti and placing her body amid struggles against various forms of neoliberal extractivism, particularly mining. Welcome, Catherine, and looking forward to this conversation with you.
Well, kia ora, and also I'd like to mihi to Ngāti Rangatani, whose whenua we are on, and to CARE, and congratulations on your 10th anniversary. I'm very privileged to be here and to be here on this special day, at this special time.
Thank you, Catherine. And really, what is so powerful about your work and the kind of conversational space it creates for us is the ways in which you bring anti-capitalism and anti-colonialism together. So perhaps we can begin by talking a little bit about how those two strands are interconnected.
Well, I think for me it goes right back to my ancestry, being from the British Raj and from the Irish working class. And these things are often treated as separate when they're utterly interlinked. And I think if you look at Aotearoa, a colonised country where the project was always extractivism from day one, from the British Empire, it's been clear that my culture, the Pākehā culture, has benefited from a capitalist approach to land in particular, but also to industrialising this country to benefit ourselves. And yes, my father's family were the Irish working class and came out of extreme poverty and remained poor and couldn't even buy a house. My father, we came here in 1864 from Ireland. My father bought a house through the state advances in 1953, the year I was born. So there have always been working class and underclass people of all cultures here. But primarily this is a colonial project, this country, and we have not faced it and not dealt with it. At the same time, hyper-capitalism, neoliberalism, and the hideous coup d'etat led by Roger Douglas has meant that both our environment and our society has continued to be racist, has continued to be extractive, and we're now in a right mess as a result. And we're not a progressive country despite the amazing PR that the current government likes to project.
There is so much to unpack right there,
okay.
Catherine. Let's just trace a little bit your learnings that you sort of hinted upon a little bit.
Yep.
You talked about your working class upbringing, if you will. So do you want to talk about how that shaped your journey as an activist?
Sure. I mean, I felt like looking back, I was both very privileged and also impacted in not always good ways by growing up in a fundamentalist Marxist family. My father was an economic Marxist, and he literally thumped the table every day on the importance of those things, but not and we had pictures of Stalin that then moved to Lenin, that then moved to Mao, that then moved to Cuba, to Fidel. So, and, in some ways, it was a rich exposure to internationalism and other ideas. We had people from the South African struggle staying in the house. We had left-wingers from Indonesia, students who'd come staying in the house, things like that, which are very educational, even if you don't understand it at the time. But at the same time, the fundamentalism and patriarchy that went with that meant that I think it had a negative effect, and in fact, I'm probably the only one in the family that feels comfortable in politics as a result, because what I have learned is fundamentalism is dangerous, and being confrontational for the sake of it is not necessarily always strategic. And so we need to learn from other cultures than our own and other worldviews and other voices of marginalised people. So we started off working class but became middle class through our education and through growing up in a time in this country when there was actually a lot more resources for poorer people. Like my parents could afford to buy a house. We had the benefit system, the family benefit. We could choose whether to have jobs or not when we were young. We would go to a job for half a day, earn some money and leave again with no worries. I mean, you cannot imagine that now. Rents were affordable. So we grew up in that time, and what it did is I grew up with all the contradictions of growing up on the left, which was a white male left. That's all it was. There was no colonial analysis, except quietly from my mother, who grew up in the barrage and actually always rejected it. And internationally, my father, who was a Freirean as well, and including meeting with Pauli Freire when he came to Aotearoa in the 70s, he had an internationalism, but he didn't understand his own country. And so I guess the big learning for me was, through moving to Hauraki and meeting with tangata whenua, was the education about here we are here, and what does extractive capitalism mean in terms of Te Tiriti and the subjection of tangata whenua lands and peoples to that particular system. So I have learned so much, both from having a childhood that brought up issues of you must participate in community, that the theoretical and rhetorical words around justice, to realising that justice is about hearing from marginalised people, and that can be within your movement as well as without.
Catherine, I really can relate much to the kind of upbringing you talk about, particularly the images of Lenin and Stalin, and then Ho Chi Minh, and sort of a deep internationalist consciousness, if you will. And a key part of that kind of analysis is working through dialectics and fundamental class antagonisms. What is the relevance of that classical Marxist analysis to contemporary struggles?
It's a great question, and I'm a little bit allergic to reading Marxist doctrine because of the way it was shoved down my throat. And I just am a little bit allergic, but I'm surrounded by people who do that reading and then translate it for me. So I guess for me, 19th century patriarchy, 20th century Marxism, all of those issues, I think we have to take the structural, powerful analysis around economic realities that still exists and hasn't changed, and in fact in some ways through neoliberalism has become almost Victorian in its extremities, British Victorian in its extremities. That still completely exists, and you can see it in the labour market now, you can see it in the growing inequality that is being normalised, that poverty is a failure of personal choice rather than the success of the elite in extracting the wealth from our bodies and from our land. But, there were voices that were never heard in that debate. So I'm very interested in moving away from the idea that the West and the West interpretation of those ideas around class are the future, or the only voices that we need to hear. And I think the global South and the Indigenous voices are so much more stimulating, so much more creative and so much more human, while also having an absolute robust understanding. And that's from working with people like, for example, my friend Ralph Regenvanu, who is in the opposition in the Vanuatu Parliament, they threw out the British and the French as colonisers, and they're trying to build a nation, and it's not easy within, you know, the, Pacific cultures and Westminster democracy conflicts. But, you know, I find that people like him very inspiring in their willingness to challenge free trade. You know, people from all over the world who I've met, particularly the Papuans who are fighting for a green state as well as fighting for their fundamental survival as people, and their absolute commitment to protecting the environment as well. And, you know, there are just inspirations from these communities that I've had privileges of working with. But primarily, it's here that I've done my learning, by staying here, working on local issues, fighting multinationals in my own home, probably taught me more than anything. So from the late 1970s, 1980, my area, the area I live in, the Hauraki, which is the home of the Pare Hauraki 12 and more iwi, is full of gold. And so the multinationals came, and they come whenever the price goes up, they come to extract the gold. And we have been fighting them for 40 years, and I've been active in most of that time. And I'm still really active. We're about to go to court again. But that really taught me what is care for the land. And the kuia that I need to acknowledge, Betty Williams of Ngāti Maru Ngāti Whanaunga, who educated me, who passed away last year, she said, what are you for? You know, you people who want to protect, you know, birds and water, but what about the gold itself? What about the life force of that? And we were all like, I never even thought about that. You know, there's a deeper worldview here, and that's what's educated me. And I will always be an outsider in the sense that Pākehā culture is an outsider on the inside of power.
So, you know, you talk about learning from tangata whenua, and what created that entry point for you to recognize that there needs to be that space created for learning?
Absolutely good question. I lived in a little hut when I was a hippie, with grass growing on the roof opposite a mountain. And that mountain became so powerful in my life. And the mountain is Te Moina Hau or Tamatakapua, the sacred mountain of the Hauraki and the Te Arawa people. And that mountain was going to, the mining company from Canada called Otter Minerals said they would turn it into a lake for us, for the locals. And they came to the local hall, and Te Arawa came up from Rotorua, and Hauraki came from the other parts of Hauraki, and they stood in that hall alongside us, I don't know, maybe 80 hippies, and they said that they would not allow their mountain to be touched. And then they said to us, we offer to share with you the guardianship of this mountain. But I could tell there was more to it than what we experienced at that moment. And I just started working with Auntie Betty, who used to come and be a member of Coromandel Watchdog of Hauraki and offer us all this learning. And I think my childhood meant that I was open to a much more analytical approach than many people who just wanted to stop the mining because it's in our backyard. But that's never been the worldview I was raised with. So I started listening to what she was saying and maintaining a personal relationship. And I was so lucky to be educated by someone like that, who also had an international experience of challenging multinationals, but who, and was a teacher, but was also an absolutely rigorous, analytical, political leader. That people found her very challenging in her own community, let alone the rest of the world. But how wonderful that was. And so through Betty's challenge about, well, where is Hiaha, Te Tiriti or Waitangi, I started learning about it, and then I started teaching it. And you know how it is, when you teach, you learn. And I'm still learning about it through trying to teach it. But she was just the beginning. So I started, that opened a lot of doors. And I guess all the work that I've done related to whenua, like, for example, with the sawmill workers on contaminated sites and all of those others, inevitably brings up issues of who's whenua. And they have continued to educate me. And my partner, who's an archaeologist, anthropologist and disability activist, also educated me because he worked on a river for many years with the three iwi of the Mata Atua area. And what I learned from him was how to be respectful of everybody and recognise tangata whenua. It's their business to sort out their authority and their place. It's our business to work with all of them and to listen to all of them and to support their leadership. So I've had tremendous practical experiences of this, made a lot of mistakes, had to apologise for them, but it's been a really dynamic and exciting part of working to protect the environment. And now my work is a lot about working with Pākehā environmental groups, trying to get them to take that step of recognition of Māori tangata whenua authority and what Te Tiriti requires of us.
It seems within that context that working with the environment has to go almost hand in hand with challenging racism.
You'd think. Unless you happen to be a racist, in which case, or of a racist, we're all raised in a racist world, the people that I work with, but it is interesting, the resistance. And part of that resistance is the idea that we know more about the environment than Māoris do, and that Māoris don't have a right to economic success and self-determination in their own country. Therefore, we only want to work with the good ones who are going to adopt our view. So the view of nature as a museum and as a space for preservation and conservation versus the view of a whakapapa-based community that lives off the land, it feeds itself from the land, and it feeds the land in right relationship through a spiritual practice. Those two worldviews do not mesh unless we are prepared to look at ourselves in my culture and recognise that we are not Indigenous to this country, and we are not the holders we are never going to be the kaitiaki, and we are not the holders of the most intimate relationship with the whenua. And people struggle with that because they love birds. I sound flippant, but I just see my own culture still trying to control the discourse around what is protecting the environment, just as like we try to control the discourse around virtually anything.
So, as Tauiwi, for grounding this idea of listening, it seems to resonate throughout this conversation. Do you want to talk about how does one build this habit of listening? Well,
people would laugh that you asked me because they think I'm a terrible listener because I talk a lot. But you know what? I can multitask. So one of the things you can do is you can listen and talk at the same time. And that was how I grew up. My family system, my partner was shocked because we all talk over each other, but we all know exactly what everyone said. So I sort of feel like if you open yourself up and share your story, others will share theirs. And I always end up knowing a lot about other people, despite the fact that I have said a lot. So, but I guess I'm talking about listening in a less literal way. I'm talking about going to Waitangi every year for 20 years and sitting at the back of the political tent and listening to every single word and reading every single essay I can find by Moana Jackson, who I was privileged to have as a mentor. And he used to send me the most encouraging little notes. And he did that for so many people. And I am still devastated that this country has lost possibly its greatest citizen that I've ever met in terms of articulating a more positive vision and for being able to work across colonisation and trauma. I mean, Moana just has left us so much. But listening, listening I think is a multifaceted practice. And if you get it wrong, I think getting it wrong is actually really important, and then learning how to not to walk away when you get it wrong, but to actually just listen deeper and go, okay, someone's trying to tell me something here that I'm not hearing. Because colonization doesn't actually bring out the sensitive, empathetic human being. It's all about dominance. And dominance isn't about listening. So I wouldn't claim that I personally am a great listener, but I would claim that listening and really hearing relies on doing your own work and your own learning. And one of the things we're doing in this little group that I've started with my friends in Hauraki, The Basket, which is an ally group on environmental and social justice, is doing a reading group so that after people do Te Tiriti education, most of them Pākehā, we invite them into a reading group so that we can keep on reflecting and learning and doing the work we need to do in order to be able to hear what is actually being said to us patiently and tenaciously, time after time, by tangata whenua. And they must be so sick of it. But you know, that is our job, and so we have to educate ourselves as well as listen deeply.
You know, and that focus on voice and voices of tangata whenua, articulating and leading that change process, it really converges well with the COPUP of the culture-centered approach, which talks about building voice infrastructures. And one of the challenges that we see in our work is that when voices do emerge that are transformative, there are so many structural forces that seek to silence those voices. So, you know, given the history of work that you have done, Catherine, I wonder what lessons we can learn about how to sustain these voice infrastructures, especially when they become threatening to the structures.
Yes, that's a very big question. I'm thinking about, I was facilitating a panel on the Treaty Futures annual webinar series, and it was about tangata whenua and environmentalism, and I had Tina Nata speaking and Te Tuhi Bailey from Parihaka, and we were cyber attacked, and I hadn't been through that experience before. And this is not the subtle ongoing denigration of radical Māori voices. This was a very crude and direct attack on Māori women. But I thought it was very interesting that there is now an organised and really quite predictable but scary attack on people like Tina for speaking the truth that she speaks to power every day. And so, yeah, I think that that attack is everywhere, and I suppose working with the sawmill workers, one of the things I learned is that process is really important, and that people who have so-called no education and have lived with capitalism using their bodies to poison them and their families, that their leadership is a different form of leadership than mine, and that my job in relation to that is to support their leadership so that they can, because they have to engage with the tools of the Pākehā. Like, for example, we're in the middle of a fight with ACC at the moment around getting these workers and their families' health conditions recognised, and myself and my partner, he wrote this book called The Deadly Legacy, which is about dioxin in this country, and it's about being good translators to support the voices to do what they want to do with the knowledge that is locked into the Pākehā system and has not been available to them, but which they have an incredibly powerful ability to take and to use to challenge. But yes, they are under attack all the time, and I think about those guys. You know, the unions of this country should have taken that issue and have fought with those workers and made it into a huge issue, and yet they will respond when we ask them to, but there is no ongoing commitment to these people who've been poisoned in the workplace in the most horrific way, and who the company that did it just walked away, as they all do. And you know, that stuff happens all the time. So it is a real challenge, and I think the thing about marginalised voices is you have to learn to hear them, because we actually have been taught in Pākehā culture to learn to ignore them. So you actually have to learn to try to hear differently. It comes back to the listening point, I guess, and recognise that people from other cultures automatically understand more about us than we do about ourselves. And so they have to deal with the fact that we are, if you ask a Pākehā about being Pākehā, we don't even know what that is, but everyone else does. You know? Everyone else, we're so visible, and so we're not very self-aware. And a lot of it's just about make space, step back, and just hear what the radical people, because radical means the root of the matter, right? So there are a lot of people who are of different cultures but are not particularly radical, but we need our radicals so badly. We really do. We need our radicals we need to give radical support to the radical voices of tangata whenua and other marginalised communities. But of course, I don't want to lump them in with marginalised communities, because we actually live in a country where they are the rangatira. So we have to acknowledge the rangatira all the time and their leadership, but also recognise that our country now, thank goodness, is so much less white. And there are so many other rich cultures who bring to the table an experience of colonialism that I've never experienced. And they don't want me mediating that relationship. That's one thing I've learned. And it's been affecting the treaty movement, because the treaty movement of educators has been Pākehā taking responsibility to be good allies to Māori, but now with all the other cultures, we have had the young people challenging us from particularly South Asia, saying, hang on a minute, we've been through colonialism, we know we're not mana whenua, we're not Indigenous, but we don't want you Pākehās who come from the imperial background mediating our relationship with tangata whenua. And you see great groups like Asians Supporting Rangatiratanga, which is an amazing group of young people. That stuff. And so stand back for that voice. Here they come. This is the future. It's exciting. Yeah.
You know, what is so exciting about this vision is also the many connections that flow in many different directions. So I want to come back to that anti-colonialism and anti-capitalism critique.
Yeah.
So if you think about this notion that to actually see transformation, we need changes fundamentally in the colonial system, and we need changes in the capitalist system, and they are of course intertwined. How do we then connect that in terms of everyday practice? So how do we connect decolonization struggles with working class struggles?
Yes, especially when you have a working class that doesn't even see itself as the working class.
Yeah.
Which is the 21st century precariat and, you know, 0-hour contract nightmare that people face.
Yep.
And one of the things is it the role of the middle class privileged who have the space and the privilege to actually do some of that leadership, or is that just co-opting the situation? I mean, these are real questions that have gone on for a long time. They're not new, but the divide and rule strategies against working class cultures, other than Māori not working with Māori. I mean, those are real risks. And I noticed today that the National Party won't rule out dropping the treaty if they want to form a government with David Seymour and ACT Party. So it's becoming polarised around that. And this is very, very scary, dangerous politics, because there will be people who are suffering in the system who think that the problem is Māori and that Māori get all these things, especially if they get their information and media from the talkback. So the vision of Mātiki Mai, which was created by tangata whenua, I think it was about 2012 that they started doing, they finally finished the report that was led by Moana Jackson, Professor Margaret Motu and Veronica Tawhai, Dr. Veronica Tawhai. Like, that vision includes everybody. And it talks about what do we all value. And it talks about fundamental values of place and community that include everybody, that everybody needs to get what they need, and that we need to live in right relationship with the earth, as well as... It makes it clear that capitalism cannot deliver. I mean, we know capitalism can't deliver because look at the state of everything, of inequality in the planet. We also know that monolithic state communism didn't actually protect the environment and didn't recognise ethnicity and Indigenous rights. I mean, it's highly problematic. So how do we build those connections when people don't even identify? I think we have to find other ways. I think stories are powerful about common interest, and we need to be better at reimagining the world. But we have to respect the fact that people are capable of reimagining the world. All people, and particularly those who are not benefiting from the system, they have more to give, more to offer. When I was a beneficiary advocate on Rāwhiti, you know, the beneficiaries on the at the absolute bottom of that heap were still more generous and more community minded than many people who were sitting in their, you know, their vast farms and their huge houses. I mean, I'd never seen such big houses as they have, white people have on the East Coast, and it was really instructive seeing that difference. But it's all about relationships. I mean, that the greatest saying that guides my work is the quality of whatever it is we're doing depends on the quality of relationships. And so collective relationship building with Pākehās who see themselves as individuals and who neoliberalism is encouraged to see as individuals for whom shopping is an identity rather than their class, rather than their rights, rather than their responsibilities to their community. That played out in COVID in a very ugly way, and it still is, because it's all about me and protecting myself and the mantra of choice. And so we're up against those narratives to build those kind of the kind of synergies we really have to have if we're going to bring together a recognition of decolonisation and replacing capitalism. And I use the word replacing in a slightly sort of frivolous way, but it's not frivolous, because actually what people are hungry for is the possibility that we can reimagine the world and it can be different, and there is a place for us. And nobody is saying you have to leave the country, but seriously, we need to talk about land back, because we haven't done it, and we need to seriously talk about how we do that without creating further grievance, but with justice. You know, these are intergenerational, long-term problems. And I was talking to one of the staff here, and he was saying we do what we can in our own time, and and it isn't always obvious. I mean, I just felt quite heartened by his whakaaro around every person's role is in their time to give what they can give to that particular question, and not to be hopeless, because we don't know what we've planted until, you know, the seeds produce things that which we don't always expect. In other words, I don't know how to do this, but I'm willing to try to be part of the project.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the truth.
Right. And you know, it's quite powerful that you bring up Matike Mai within this context. I would love to hear more in terms of how Matike Mai envisions the role of Pākehā, the role of migrant and ethnic communities in this process of transformation.
Yeah, well, if you take that very simple drawing, which was one of many about how we might reorganise society, you see the tangata whenua sphere, and then the tangata tiriti sphere, which includes you and I and all of our cultures. And the real challenge for us is how do we organise our own sphere, because Westminster democracy, majoritarian politics, is not working for us. It's working for a very small group of people, and also people are so depoliticised that they're actually they think voting once every 3 years is politics. It's not politics. You know, it's actually ridiculous, and majoritarianism is a failure in terms of actually hearing who needs to be heard and how power works. And 9 years in Parliament just reinforced for me Westminster politics is violent and adversarial, and it's a failure. And it only benefits the elite. So we've got everything to gain once we can help people see that in that space we can create something that works better for us, and then we move into the relational space where we negotiate the future under Te Tiriti and he whakaputanga around a better future. And what I love about the way they created Mātiki is the values. They didn't start with the structures or they started with the human values. And it's really interesting to me, given my life's work that I'm involved with, how the young people, the rangatahi stream, they put one value at the top, and that was the relationship with Papa Tuanoku. Because they were saying, in our time, what we see is, in terms of the climate, which is a symptom. The climate's only a symptom. It's not a thing of itself. It just tells you that we have created a climate that doesn't work for future generations. And so for them it's so clear. You know, they actually are very, very clear that that relationship with Papa Tuanoku has to come first. So, you know, maybe the conservationists got something to learn from them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and this is really radical in terms of transforming where we go to learn. And Matike Mai offers us that kind of a pedagogical anchor that actually shifts, if you will, the space of learning, and in that sense resists the ongoing erasure. But it also, Catherine, offers us a register for challenging the technocratic, neoliberal approach to climate change, doesn't it?
Well, yes, and it needs to. I mean, what a joke. The West cannot fix the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house, Audre Lorde. You cannot do it. The West we have lost our way. And it's the idea that we can, to me it's all summed up by Elon Musk, somebody who I literally can't look at because it's so boring and so uncreative. The idea that this is a technical problem when it's actually a problem of social relationships. It's all about the failure of the relationships in terms of the earth and in terms of people. So the West needs to step aside and allow other cultures who actually know how to live with less energy use. I was talking to your colleague from Bangladesh, and they've been living with flooded land for millennia. Yep. And yes, it's getting worse as a result of the pollution from industrialized techno-capitalism. But they have more answers than we have. But we're not used to thinking about that. People are still just trying to greenwash this whole situation. Politicians are trying to greenwash it. Business people are trying to greenwash it. Well, how can we make money out of climate change? What can we do that will actually tinker around the outside? And the whole thing's around the emissions trading scheme. It's just a money go round. Planting a whole lot of pine trees without actually knowing what you're doing with it. It's just short-term thinking. It's just completely, it's completely disconnected from the ecological reality, but also from the social reality. And the people who are going to carry the weight are the poor of the world. Like the reason my friend Ralph has taken from Vanuatu has taken, and his people have gone to the International Court of Justice over climate change is because they know they didn't cause it, but they're the ones that are going to live with. They've already had their whole GDP was wiped out from one cyclone that hit one of the island groups. So that's all their GDP for their whole country, and they've hardly got any resources. So these are the voices. Listen to them. What are they saying we need to do? I have faith in the Global South and Indigenous leadership. The Indigenous networks around the world are amazing. And they have got vision, and they have got a concept of relationships that will help us halve our consumption, because it's not about business as usual and us continuing to consume resources and consume energy. We can't do that anymore. A few solar panels ain't going to fix the oil crisis. It's good to have them if you're rich enough, but it's not going to fix it. We have built an entire civilization on one particular fossil fuel that's killing us, and we want to keep going. We need to listen to the people who have never consumed at that rate. Right across the Global South, there are people who've never wasted resources the way that the waste and consumption cycle of capitalism, which capitalism can't survive without it, the growth mantra, we don't know what to do about it. We're addicted, but we're also addicted to power. So it's going to be hard to get us to listen, because really I see the positive, creative solutions, and they are everywhere, in South America, in India, in Southeast Asia, in Africa, in the Pacific. These are the inspirational people, but they're not the people that people have, the West have ever wanted to hear from, because we've been too busy colonizing and extracting from them. Mm-hmm. So we have to, we can't use the technology that they're tinkering with to be another colonizing process. We actually need to stop and listen to the different voices.
Mm-hmm. So, one of the things that becomes quite apparent is the ways in which things like sustainability ratings and rankings are being used to prop up solutions to climate change. And particularly within that context, I'm very aware of the kind of institutions that are then projected as the spaces that are going to deliver the solutions to climate change, such as, say, the World Economic Forum, which is a space of global elites. But on the other hand, you have this far-right disinformation network that use the trope of World Economic Forum, the global elite control, to actually polarize and divide the publics. So I guess the question is, how does one work through, on one hand, interrogating the ways in which concepts like sustainability are co-opted, and on the other hand, attempting to secure dialogic spaces for positive transformation?
Well, one of the problems has been the collapse of the left. I mean, really, we don't have, in this country at least, a clear, coherent, alternative voice. And it's difficult without that voice to create even balance, let alone transformation and revolution. And that's one of the problems, is that as you said, so clearly stated, we have these the rise of fascism is always a possibility when there's any kind of economic or social fragility. Fascism sits there in the background waiting for the opportunity to co-opt people and manipulate people into authoritarian solutions. And that's happening right now, and in many parts of the world, and it's quite frightening. And it's not that it's not here. I mean, we saw 51 people get killed in a mosque in Otatahi, and we still have people going around denying that they're saying it was a false flag, and all of that rhetoric that social media allows. So social media now allows so much more access to people's fears and vulnerabilities, and yet we don't really have, particularly through the neoliberal discourse in this country, we don't really have a politicised population willing to engage with what else we can do. It's not, the alternative is not being fascism or the global elite, but actually the sense of the common good and the community and the solidarity that we desperately need, except when you look at Indigenous cultures, because they work from a collective perspective. So individualism cannot respond effectively to these challenges, and can be co-opted by these challenges of fascism and elitism. So, it is a very scary time in that way, in terms of where we have got to and what do we do about it, because sustainability has become economic sustainability. It's been co-opted by capitalism into yet another terminology for greenwashing, and it takes us nowhere. And yet to sustain life, ultimately, there is a whole lot of really deep corridor which is meaningful and which we need to reconnect with. But the urbanisation of the population has dislocated people from the land, but so also the colonial project is based on dominating land rather than living with land. And so these things play into quite a negative scenario, actually. And so I'm trying to think, well, there are sparks of light, and like I said before, they're in the global south, they're in the Indigenous world, and so those sparks of light, I think people like us, who are people with privilege and voice on the left, need to be amplifying those voices, so that we can actually see that there are many creative things we can do in response to both fascism and in response to elitism, because we all know it doesn't work. But there's clearly a narrative that teaches people they should love and wish to emulate their elite, rather than love and wish to emulate community, which actually nurtures the human soul, as well as feed the body and provide meaningful work and a decent social environment. So it's about trying to grab those things that are happening that are really good and try to amplify them. But it's difficult, because we here in this sort of parochial little country, we don't even have these conversations except in very rare and beautiful places like this, and Kotare Trust and others. And that's what worries me, is that we don't. We have individuals who do great things, but within Tauiwi cultures, these struggles are not. There are not very many spaces for this kind of dialogue. And that's serious.
Yeah.
We really need to work on that, because I have great faith in young people. I meet wonderful young people all the time, and they are really willing to address marginalisation. They're less confident about economic alternatives. Sometimes they revert to the idea that we should just be very local. Well, I lived in small communities, and I know that small can be good, but can also be highly problematic, depending on whether you've dealt with patriarchy, which is quite a big problem, and also dealt with power issues generally. It's skilled, it's to have a tikanga, have a process to make a community work in a way that includes all people and actually looks after everything. That takes skill, and it takes a culture that neoliberalism can't deliver. So yeah.
In this, I love the idea of the collective and the notion of collectivism that you offer. At the same time, coming from having grown up in the context of the Global South and a progressive context of the Global South with the anti-colonial politics in India, and then seeing over the last decade how that has transformed into politics of hate, anchored in Hindutva, which is an ideology which is fundamentally about othering Muslims and is Islamophobic. So in that sense, it is quite similar to the manifesto of the Christchurch terrorist. And that ideology too uses the language of collectivism, community, and decolonization. So, one of the things I've been grappling with is how do you resist that, particularly in terms of perhaps putting forth the notion of decolonization needing to be fundamentally progressive in character.
Yeah, absolutely. Fundamentally progressive and anti-patriarchal. Because if it's not okay for us to challenge power structures or challenge those in authority, then you don't have a society. You don't have a collective. What you have is a dictatorship. And people are attracted by that when they're feeling vulnerable, and I completely agree that we see all over the world pockets of very negative force gathering around those kinds of ideas, and what's happening in India is terrifying. It's the opposite of a community based on care. And so that's why I love the word care, because I guess I was really inspired by Rian Eisler's book on the caring economy, because it values the work and the economic value of looking after people, and of valuing difference, and of supporting activity that is non-destructive. And so to me, that is the collective. But it's not easy to know how to foster that when inside a individualistic situation. And then what you're raising is that a different tradition, but it can become manipulated into a violent and xenophobic tradition. And I guess what we have to learn from all over the world is how easily that can be manipulated, and not to take that lightly, and not to regard that as it couldn't happen here. Because, I've been in a mob situation. I was in the Springbok tour when we stopped the rugby game in 1981, and I saw the people outside the game come running out to attack us physically, and they were yelling things like Jews, the N-word, communists. It was like some weird archetypal othering took place because we'd stopped a rugby game to support, to stop racism. And, it just taught me that human beings can be manipulated, and those memes that have been flooded, those toxic memes that have flooded throughout our narratives, are available when the polarization happens and can be manipulated. So, there's so much work to do in changing those narratives. And what I found difficult about when the Human Rights Commission, for example, says, this is not us, we're not a racist country, I don't find that helpful. Well, I just think we have to say this is us, and there's stuff we can do about it. And we have to do that work. Those of us who come up, racism is a stream we're swimming in. Fundamentalism is a dimension of patriarchy, and both of those systems are violent, and we can be better than that. But it's not because we are better than that. We're not. We actually have to be real about who we are and what we live with, and what the impact of that is. But critical thinking is not taught. Who teaches critical thinking? Who teaches power analysis? We need to, as somebody was saying on a Kotare discussion the other day, we need mass education around critical thinking. Because if you're thinking critically, you can't support Hindutva, because it's othering your neighbour with whom is a decent and wonderful family that lives next door to you, who just happens to have different spiritual practices, but ultimately they're all about love of life, But it's so easy to manipulate when you've got, especially the strong man is a horrible thing. I really want more weak men in the world. I really like even when people like Destiny try to heal the damaged men who've been through the prison system and talk about, being the strong man that leads the family, I'm like, oh no, could you just be a good person? Could you just be a partner? Could you just be could kindness and care be the values that you, and if you've not experienced kindness and care, I think strength is because strength very close to violence and control is very damaging,
I am so glad you brought up the example of Destiny, because some of the field work that we at CARE have done, particularly our colleagues Phoebe and Steve that you met in Glen Innes. One of the things that is emergent from that field work is the ways in which for Maori and Pacifica communities negotiating hardships, economic hardships, that space becomes a space of support.
Absolutely, and you can't deny that humans like to be part of a group, and when they're struggling, if they become part of a group where they're valued and where they're safe, then that is a very, very powerful incentive. And it's just, where does it take you?
Yeah.
And I mean, a friend of mine went undercover into a Destiny church, and they had the ATM machines at the back. So it's about taking your money as well as about giving you a place. And the failure of the prison system is at the heart of this. I was on a wonderful, the Women's Centre in Auckland, who I've done quite a bit of treaty work, are running a series with Stacey Morrison, or the many, many great women, and the last one was Julia Whaiapoti talking about this. And she said there's no place for prison. There is a place for people to be kept away from society if they are in a state where they cannot be safe for others. But that's very different from creating a prison, which is a punishment model. And I think about Moana Jackson's amazing work showing that one of the things that is the most frightening about it is that in the 1980s, I think it was, when he did his first justice report, the female women population in prison was 15% Māori, which was about reflective of the demographic, the percentage of the overall population. Now it's 60% Māori women in female prisons. So what's going on? Who is locking up all these women and therefore separating them from their children? And what is the consequence of that for another generation? It is so damaging, so damaging. And I mean, fundamentalist Christianity can't really respond to critical thinking because it's based on, it's basically based on some very toxic ideas, homophobic, patriarchal ideas. But we have to acknowledge the pull, the power of being part of a group where people actually believe that you, who've been through colonisation, that you can be in trauma, that you can actually be healed and be valued and be a respectable human with a place in the world, which everyone wants. In their heart, everybody wants a place, and everyone's struggling for a place. And they found meaning in the Destiny Church. Well, that's just an indictment of our entire system.
What I love about your analysis is it looks at something like disinformation, for instance, which is something we work quite a bit on digital disinformation and hate. But you take a view that is more global. You zoom out and you say that, well, to actually look at this landscape of disinformation is not enough to just look at the digital architecture, but it is actually important to look at the prison system, the colonial structure of the prison system, and then perhaps think about questions of abolition as really the fundamental strategy of resistance.
And if I think it would be a great strategy, but if you abolish prison, then you have to answer the question, how are we going to support people? And the answer to those questions are in communities. There are amazing community leaders, I'm sure, in this town, and I have met around the country, who have other ways of supporting people. If you look at the marae-based justice system, it's not an easier option. Facing your own people is not easier than going to jail and being labelled and being offered an opportunity to join join that particular group, because no matter how traumatized, it's still a group. So it's actually really, really hard to face the consequences of your actions inside a tikanga-based system. And I think it's much more powerful. And I think when you look at the justice system, I don't think it works for anybody to dislocate us from our communities and make the law, the so-called, this whole Westminster thing, like the whole idea of neutral, unbiased judgment. I mean, when I was watching the Ginsburg documentary last night, I was thinking, you know, these people fundamentally believe that the American Constitution is the best thing in the whole world. And there's something to me that's fundamentally problematic about talking about the pursuit of happiness as if it's some kind of individual act. Individuals pursuing happiness has led to complete meltdown and capitalist nightmare. That is not, it is not the pursuit of happiness. It's the pursuit of relationship and connection that's going to save us. And we need to get rid of the prisons, otherwise they'll all, you know, destiny will always have a market. You know, and if we don't want them to have a market, what are we doing? You know, how are the dispossessed? And it's, you know, the need for both a spiritual and economic home. What are we creating that has any meaning for those people who've been dispossessed? And I was a youth worker. So I had 50 Māori kids and a broken pool table in a building. And most of those kids had been expelled from the local school or were in the process of being expelled because the school had offered them nothing, and they walked with their feet. And I actually respected those kids. Like, why would you go in there to be abused? So these kids, these truants that everybody labels, they are walking out of the education system because the education is failing them. We have failed to value them as for who they are. And when I took them away in a group, I've never been with a more functional group in terms of looking after each other, in terms of collective organising, in terms of, you know, feeding each other, and also being fun and having a great time. But, you know, the system has rejected them. So these kids are labelled from day one, and what are we offering them as a society? We're offering them assimilation models in the education system. You can be as good as Pākehā. You know, I just think it's highly problematic. Like the justice system is one thing, but if you get me started on education, because this has been my passion since I was a 15-year-old schoolgirl, is that we have to change the dynamic. And the first thing I did when I got into Parliament was I went around 16 alternative schools and low decile schools, and I said to the teachers, don't want you in the room. And I asked the kids, what should it smell like? What should it look like? What does a real education feel like? And they told me, and I recorded this. And it inspired me to continue my work, because these kids knew that what they wanted was a human environment with plants and animals and with people who listen to them. And they said, we can tell whether teachers respect us or not. We know. We know who's safe to be in the classroom with, but so many are not. Really interesting. And so I want to revolutionise the education system as well as the prisons. By lunchtime.
By lunchtime, right? And we are on to it.
We're trying.
Yes. You know, one of the things, Catherine, in terms of thinking about this transformation really, and you talked about Roger Douglas and that kind of economic transformation. I want to visit that, because it almost seems like that kind of large-scale transformation is almost missing from the discursive register come 2022. And here we are projecting ourselves on the global stage as a progressive nation with all the performances of decolonization, if you will, on the surface. Have we actually moved away from those changes of the 1980s and created something new in your assessment? Or are we continuing to perpetuate that ideology?
We utterly have not moved away, and I think you can tell by most of those trips overseas, apart from the few, you know, cosy little speeches at Harvard, are actually about free trade. So we bought completely into neoliberal economics, and that's our main driver. Every government since the 80s has continued that drive for free trade economics, and that tells you we can never fix these problems while we are completely committed to free market capitalism, and that hasn't changed. I don't see any vision for anything greater. You know, the bar is so low internationally that the Prime Minister can't help but look good because she's an intelligent person and has some good speechwriters. The bar's very low because then you've got Bolsonaro, or, you know, you've got, you know, there's just so many leaders that just make your flesh creep. I mean, Trump was the extreme, but he is not the only one, and he only got there because of algorithms and, you know, the Crosby texter machine that is there to promote the right wing. So, yeah, I don't think we have moved very far at all from the 1980s, and Labor never really rejected it. And so when I was for 9 years on the Education and Science Select Committee at Parliament, the constant neoliberal assault on, this was under National with John Key, a particularly unpleasant era to be in Parliament, but they're all pretty unpleasant. You know, they oversaw a serious attack on tertiary education through a number of pieces of legislation, and then they also tried to completely sabotage primary education for what we call the GERM, which was the Global Education Reform Movement, which is all about labelling, and it was just, we just spent our entire time trying to defend the basic idea that public, the word public, was valid. So here we are in 2022, and here are the, you know, the tertiary professionals having to strike because the concept of public, of institutions dedicated to students rather than profit, we haven't changed at all, and government's not done anything to do that. I mean, I don't know about the politics. I don't know that making Te Pūkenga as one institution will change the ethic, because it's not an ethic of care, it's not a culture-centred approach, it's an ethic of privatisation and profit. And while that's the ethic, the students are going to come last, and the teachers, who are not separate from the students actually, will also come last as human beings. But we'll go on with the rhetoric because it sounds better than what the National Party would say. And I mean, it's interesting because I still do work with the education unions, and they're still having to fight Labor over fundamental ideas that they shouldn't be fighting over. I mean, Labor, of course, are better than National on education, but really, you know, it's still a battle. It's still an absolute battle for kura kaupapa Māori to get proper resources. They've had to go to the Waitangi Tribunal. You know, it's just a continual fight, and it's not a space where our teachers can focus on critical thinking. And, you know, for me, if you ask me what is education for, it is for human liberation. And education as a Freerian or whatever I am, I don't know, is because it is between you and I that we create learning, and that we learn from each other, and through that dialogue and through that respect for everybody's knowledge. I love working with young people because they have knowledge of a world that I'm not part of, because they're the next generation, and I have knowledge of some other things, and together that's what we create.
Yep.
You know, that's learning. We learn from each other, and so we need to overthrow the education system, Mohan, and the prisons, and the Parliament through Mātiki Mai, and we need to completely renegotiate a respectful relationship with the earth, and we need to honour Te Tiriti now. But there's still time for like poetry.
Yes.
And lunch, and and there's still time for being inspired by people, because in the end, it's not so much ideology that inspires me, but it's the people. You know, when I think of, you know, the people that have inspired me and who have taught me in my life, I'm so blessed to have been around such incredible people who have taught me so much. And then you line that up against from the amazing access we have now to the world. Everything said about climate change, I heard, you know, I've heard Indigenous voices say that, you know, and that the writer is Amitav Ghosh. He just talked about the same thing about the West can never solve this stuff. That's so true.
Yeah.
You know, it's like there's like the West is invisible to itself, but everybody knows we're full of rubbish. No, and we can't do it. But we're not used to thinking like that, and we're still holding on to. One of the things I found about disturbing about the funeral of Queen Elizabeth I or II or whoever she was was a 96-year-old millionairess imperialist died at a great age to die, really. And the British were mourning something, and they were mourning their imperialism, you know, because the British are in a complete state of you know, it's utterly unequal and messed up country, and yet they're addicted to the aristocracy and addicted to the ideas that monarchy, which is a tourism enterprise that owns a lot of stuff, that's their identity. Mm-hmm. So what answer is going to come out of that?
Yeah.
What you get is Boris Johnson or Liz Truss. You don't get solutions for people.
Yeah, and I love here that you emphasize critical education. That is so vital, and yet that seems to be, and I suppose, you know, those ensconced in power also recognize that.
Oh yeah.
Which is why the organized attacks, including the attacks of the far right, whether it is digital campaigns or it is brick and mortar campaigns, are directed toward critical education, critical race theory. For instance, you can see a whole infrastructure.
Woke. Everybody's attacked for being woke. In other words, treating people with respect and actually acknowledging marginalisation is woke, and therefore they have these deliberate memes they put out to denigrate justice, because that's all it is about. It's actually about justice, and they don't want that. Someone said to me the other day, why do they keep talking about the trickle-down theory? You know, don't they know it doesn't work? And I'm like, yes, of course they know it doesn't work. They're just selling it to us. They don't want it to work, and they don't care whether it works or not, so long as they maintain their wealth. That's all it's about. The scum rises to the top, Mohan, in the economic system, and they will not. They don't believe in trickle down any more than you and I do.
Right.
But people don't know that, so you have to have these conversations about. We don't do economic conversations very well. You know, we don't talk about. And that's why I love the processes that people like when Pauli Freire came or Philippe Franchette came, the conversation about where do you get your information from, which was like heralding the disinformation age, and what is your economic reality, and what you become the person that you are, and that's so powerful. Everyone has an economic knowledge and has an economic story, and the people that know the most. I don't know if you've read the writer Branavan Kalingalingam.
Yep.
Yeah, when he talks about, I haven't read all his books, but I just read the one about the cleaner, sodden downstream, and you know, the knowledge of
you
the
hold
people.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and which is why it's also quite vital, and this is where I want to wrap up. Think that we think of the struggle to retain the space for critical education as a struggle, particularly because I see this happening globally, where policies are being formulated. You see across states in the US, for instance, now, where critical theory is being sort of banned from being taught in the classroom. And the part of it is, Catherine, that you see the flows of that here into Aotearoa, the same kind of rhetoric articulated by politicians as well as particular organizations that are built around this narrative. So I guess connecting our korero to education and thinking through what that struggle looks like, do you have any advice for how we struggle in the next 5 years?
I think the most important thing is that we have faith in ourselves and we don't give up, and we build relationships with communities so that we're not isolated, because I think the risk of isolation makes you very vulnerable. I mean, organisations like Kotare or organisations like CARE that are dedicated to critical thinking education, we need to make sure we are strongly rooted in our communities. We have relationships, we have respectful relationship with mana whenua, where we have an ability to be seen as valuable by people who we think we respect, because if we're not, they will attack us, they will try to silence that critical thinking. But I do really believe in addressing and connecting with the next generation, the younger people who believe in radical change, because I've never believed you need everybody on board. That's not how change happens. Change comes from the margins and not from the centre. So we just have to stay strong on the margins and make sure we build those margins into strong and respectful relationships that are not just reactionary but proactive, which is quite hard because it's much easier to be reactionary. And we need to maintain the kind of dialogue we're having now, so that for myself, who's not an academic, I need to be there for the academics who are daring to push for a different critical dialogue, rather than just say, oh, that's their problem, they're in the institution, let them fight it alone. Absolutely not. And it's the same for in community. We need our, because academics can bring the best coat hangers into the closet, you know, not that we're in the closet, but you know what I mean. So it's like, it's just essential to have your work and to value your work, so that communities can say, no, there is a rigorous and robust background. I was having a fight on Twitter at 6 o'clock this morning about education, as you do. And this guy was saying streaming, you know, how important it is that all the bright kids to be together so they don't have to wait for the others. And I'm like, this is not only, as somebody who personally experienced being in the top stream and being labelled as bright, I think it was very unhelpful for other people. But also, it's not only my anecdotal story, it's the research that shows that we have a bias, assumptions and bias in Western education that actually deny the intelligence of others. So the research backs us up. So we need this research. We absolutely have to be able to say, no, this is not how it works. And we're going to have to fight for critical education again and again. But actually, where else do we want to be? This is the most exciting thing, is to be able to use the best of our opportunity and voice to really make these issues alive. And in a small country, it's amazing how alive you can be and how much you can be heard, and how hard it is to shut us up. And those of us with the privilege, you know, I've been arrested a few times, and every time I'm arrested, white privilege is the first thing that I think of. Because the first time I got arrested, the policeman said to me, oh, what pretty blue eyes you've got, which is a very bizarre thing to happen to you, but it's when you're being arrested, but it was an indication that he wasn't going to be mean to me. And then when I recently got arrested over a mining thing, these are always over mining, they took us to the police station, and then they said, oh, we don't really want to charge you because you're all white people, was the subtext. But, you know, here's a cup of tea, and would you like to have a pre-charge instead of a proper charge this time, because it's only trespass? And I'm like, yeah, we'll take it, because I can't waste my time in court. But some of the other group were like, no, I've travelled a long time and I want to be arrested. And I was like, shut up. So the cop says, well, would you like to form a consensus? I'll go out of the room. Now, this is great, but this is not what happens to the dispossessed. And this is not what happens to tangata whenua in the Pairoa police station. This is what happens to me. So I need to use my power and use my privilege to actually stand behind them, because they're the people who are going to get beaten up in the cells while I get a cup of tea. It's a colonial project.
So beautiful. Catherine, you know, I as an academic, I think of, you know, the words of Ramhingangaroa Smith, who says that, you know, if someone comes to talk to me about Kapapa Maori theory, I ask them to show me the calluses on their, the blisters on their hands, you know. And I guess for academics, those of us that write about social justice in the text, in journal articles and books, the real question is, how do we place our privilege in relationship to these struggles of marginalization, you know? Absolutely.
And it's every day on the streets, because I can't walk past people asking for money, because something happens in terms of dehumanization. I know it's not system change, but that person will tell me a story that will make me remember what I need to do with my life. So we need to be connecting with people on the street all the time. I was with my grandchildren, his friend, the other day, and this boy had just been to court and he had no money to get home, and the kids were really kind of like, why did you just do that? And I'm like, well, we talked. He has whakapapa to this area. He needs to go somewhere else. He said, if I was in my hometown, I would ask an auntie for help. And I'm like, well, I'm here, I'm your auntie for the moment. That's what the world needs to look like, but it shouldn't be charity, it needs to be change. But we need to teach our kids that at the very least you can to be generous and recognise your power. And that's the starting point.
One last question, Catherine. You know, we, when we were planning this series, we talked about wanting to replace colonialism and capitalism by lunchtime. So how do we do that?
We have to have the conversation about reimagining the world. And the other day, I did a workshop with a group and we did a role play around Mātaki, and I said, okay, what are we going to do? It's that same question, like, how do we reimagine our part of this? And people were like, oh. And then we started talking about specific things like immigration. Whose responsibility is it, and what is it? And what is it about, and how are we going to deal with it? People are more than capable. They just need the space to actually imagine the world differently. And we have to keep creating those spaces and keep giving people the confidence that they can. Because we've handed our power away. We have to take our power back and recognize we have power, and we will get it wrong sometimes. But every day there's things we can do. Every day is a teachable moment, but it's also a moment for replacing what I call the death cult, which was kind of where we're living now. Because, you know, and I love the creative people, because creativity and the arts is a great way to tell stories and to foster people's, because if you can't feel it in your heart and your guts, it doesn't really matter what you think in your head. We actually have to learn to manage to be all of those things all the time and embody that experience, because our bodies will tell us what's good and what's bad, and you know, when we're afraid and when we're full of joy. And I want to be part of a joyous experience of imagining difference. I think it's possible. I think it's always been possible, and I think that it's never been simple, but it's still possible. You know. And especially when the space between us becomes about that. It's not me selling you a product. It's not you depositing the truth human being through education. It's between us.
It's a dialogue.
Yeah, and it's a dialogue, and it's also based on a respectful relationship. Because without that respect, we can't hear each other.
Yeah.
Because humans are very status orientated.
Absolutely.
And you know, we really need to acknowledge each other as real people. But you're doing it.
Oh.
And that's important.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. As we wrap up, I just wanted to make sure that we had the space for you to ask any questions of me, if you had any.
About 1 million. I guess how do you keep motivated and keep strong in the academy? I know that it's not a simple place to work, and that the attack on critical thinking starts and ends in the universities of this country, which have become... So how do you keep going?
You know, it goes back to a lot of what you said about community, really. And you know, I find that the greatest sources of sustenance come from relationships like this, with activists, with people who are struggling outside of the academe. You know, one of the things with the neoliberal transformation of the academe has been sort of the building of the walls, if you will, that have privatized us and privatized knowledge. So I think the work of CARE has created that space for me and for us as a collective to sort of walk past that and really to think of ourselves as public beings engaged in public spaces. And then when you consider knowledge within that context, it really becomes one of co-creation, one of working together to build something, and that becomes the infrastructure for transformation. So, you know, just as an example, I was sharing with you this work that we are doing in Highbury, you know, which is, if you think about Palmerston North and the politics of inequality, that space constitutes the ways in which the dominant structure creates marginality. And what we have there is something so beautiful that, you know, we have community kai and community gardens, which have become the spaces for the community to come up with really knowledge that is held within to build solutions on violence, you know, intimate
100%.
partner violence, sexual violence, violence in the community, but through conversations and dialogue. So that then structure is activated when there is an attack on me or care.
Exactly.
So you don't do
Yeah.
it instrumentally. You
Yeah.
build relationships.
Yeah, and it
but
will
those
do it.
relationships do it. You know,
Yeah.
so I recall, when sort of over the last a couple of years, when I have experienced these white supremacist attacks and then Hindutva attacks, and what has really sustained these relationships with activists who have come in to say, hey, what can we do? Do we need to organize petitions?
Yeah.
Do we need to organize
Wonderful.
protests?
Yeah.
And the broader community,
Yeah.
where I remember, and I'm just sharing a small snippet where at a point where the attack was quite violent, and I was just sharing this story informally with a Kaumatua, and he was saying, hey, let us know any time that you feel unsafe and you need to go to the university, and we will walk with you.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
I just feel so humbled and
Yeah.
honored with that.
Yeah.
And I think, Catherine, that happens when you step out of the academe into really looking at academe as part of a broader community.
I think that's a great example of real relationships and the solidarity that you and Care and Highbury, that's what can happen between you. And we've got a little group called The Basket, which we started, we're way behind Highbury, but we're working in the same field and for those same goals and those same relationships. But I think that the test is, when you're under attack, who stands with you, and I think that Kaumatua showed you who was with you, and you earned that in this country, because there's a million Pākehās who they don't even know about the possibility of that kind of wonderful support and solidarity. I think about when Jeanette Fitzsimons died, how the tangata whenua contacted me and said, we want to karanga her into the urupa, the natural burial ground, and we were so lucky to have them allow us, but they said, no, it's ours because we want this very fine person to rest in our land forever. And so these relationships are just, whether it's life or death, they are just tests of relationship, and you've done it. It's great to know that Care has that kind of real connection, because it's sadly quite rare behind the walls. But as a person that has grown up in another part of the world, do you feel a sense of home here now?
That's a profound question, Catherine. I think that, as a person who has grown up in another post-colonial context with deep history of colonization, I feel at home in relationships.
Yes, you recognize something here.
Recognize something here. And also recognize those relationships as spaces of learning. And this is the real interesting part, because I've lived in other parts of the world.
Yes.
And it is in Aotearoa that, in the broader space, if you will, I find that source of learning in a way that offers the basis for finding meaning.
Yeah.
And that part, I think, is particularly salient because, when I think about the work I was doing in the US, and a lot of it was grounded in solidarities with African American struggles, and that was really powerful, and that has stayed with me. Something, though, that has been quite unique. And then in Singapore, similarly, working with low-wage migrant workers who share some of the connections to South Asia. It's been incredible in terms of, again, finding those registers of learning and solidarity. What is really powerful about Aotearoa is this sense of something that is deeply spiritual, and that connected then to the movements around Te Tiriti. That seems at least in my lived experience of the places I've lived in, unique in terms of offering a register for how we think about ourselves, our place in the world globally, you know?
Absolutely. And I think the thing is that what you've identified is the power of indigenous spirituality, which is the ground in this country. And I remember I wrote in a thing for either the spin-off or E Tangata about every time we have a disaster, whether it's Ōtautahi terrorism or the Whakaari volcanic eruption on top of the tourists, the spiritual leadership of tangata whenua just comes and embraces everybody. And I've experienced that personally too when I've lost people and they have come to look after us and to show us how to do those things. And I guess if you're a migrant or even African American slave descendant, you don't have the indigeneity, spiritual indigeneity that is absolutely inseparable from the land. It cannot be separated. And to be in the presence of that is incredibly humbling and powerful. At the same time, it's very confronting for those of us who have benefited from colonisation, whereas you're in a different, you actually have had a mirror experience in your own country of the same people, my ancestors actually. So it's really interesting to hear that you say that that's quite unique and different here than it is. I'm sure that most countries have an Indigenous component and you have to dig deep. I met some Taiwanese Indigenous people one day and they have to struggle to survive within Taiwan because a lot of it is not Indigenous, and the whole thing about they're not allowed to go hunting, you know, the whole struggle that they've had just to exist. And what is amazing about tangata whenua here is that I really believe that they're going from strength to strength, and that no matter how many David Seymour, ACT Party, National Party, racist, paranoid bullshit, you cannot stop them. Their tenacity and their power as people with their feet on their own land is unstoppable, and it's a beautiful thing to see. So,
and you know, it seems to be something because, you know, in the US, for instance, I was first in Fargo, then in Minnesota, two places that have had strong Indigenous histories and histories of Indigenous struggle. Something that seems quite unique to Aotearoa is Te Tiriti and the kind of anchoring it offers for...
Yeah, I mean, there were many treaties signed between Indigenous American groups and the Crown and and the government, and many treaties in Australia as well. But for some reason, just having one gives us this... You know, it's funny, I've been a lot at Waitangi and I had the opportunity to do a dawn, they have a karakia a service for the dawn where everybody goes from the government and the opposition and the dignitaries, goes to the church, goes to the marae, it goes to the marae at dawn at 5 o'clock in the morning every February 6th. And I got to do the thing in front, do the karakia or the prayer or whatever it was for the Greens in front of John Key. And I used the opportunity to talk about poverty and what John Key's done to our country. But no matter what you talk about, there is in the dawn at Waitangi, which is, there's this palpable beauty there that touches people as the light comes up over that place, and you feel like there is hope here in this agreement. There is something, without it being a sacred text or having to be interpreted according to fundamental rules, because that's not helpful. There is still something about recognising that tangata whenua did not cede sovereignty, but they have allowed us to be here. I'm allowed to be here if I honour this. And there's something about that, you know, when you stand in that place, you think we are lucky. And even like the National Party would acknowledge, we are, you know, although they apparently not at the moment, but there is something enduring about that possibility. And I am really aware that we have to address the issues of economic deprivation, and it's not only that, but I think there's a unique inspiration here, which can also address inequality and injustice, and be rehumanizing for the colonizers.
And Catherine, you know, right there you talk about this idea of critical reflexivity, and it's so powerful to witness the ways in which you walk through that. And so it also, you know, made me think of something, which is that being in the context here, engaging with indigeneity, also pushes me to engage with my own question of indigeneity, and which isn't all this clean narrative of the white British colonizer coming in, and then we are the pure Hindu Indians. That is the Hindutva narrative. But in India, there are many indigenous and meaning Adivasi communities who continue to struggle for access to their land, to their water, to their resources, and which sort of within the broader backdrop of India, I think really complicates the question of indigeneity, because I think we have a tendency sometimes to perform a particular kind of social vulnerability, if you will, as Indians here in Aotearoa, that enables us to connect with tangata whenua, but the kind of critical reflexivity you're calling for actually would invite a person of Indian origin here in Aotearoa to also critically reflect upon the complexities, the power, the erasure of the multiple layers of indigeneity in the subcontinent, you know.
And such an extraordinary, complex, multi-layered history that you come from, and it's actually so big that I think people, as you say, can revert to the sort of pure romantic view of their own culture because of what's happened, but and in the struggle, but it's not 1947, you know, and you know, when my grandfather got kicked out of India, and rightly so. So so they cannot blame the suppression of diverse voices, Indigenous voices, Muslim voices. They can't blame that on the British, much as it's always convenient to blame. I mean, the British are responsible for a lot, you know, and partition certainly. But that whole, none of us come from anything pure, but all of us have something in us, I believe, that if we look deeply into our ancestry and look deeply into those stories, where we can come to see what it is that we are meant to be doing. You know, what are we called upon to do? And I think that you're playing a really important role in this country, in your own communities, by raising uncomfortable questions. And it's not, and therefore it's the allies and relationships that you have are so important outside that community, because one of the things that annoys me about my country is the really lack of interest in other countries, and a lack of understanding about what goes on, and a lack of critical thought about other parts of the world. And you know, we are tied to India through a similar colonisation process. We're tied to Australia, Canada, and the United States through being settler countries. And obviously, my mother being born in India, there is a tie there, and my ancestor being from Maharashtra state and being a woman of Indian descent is obviously affects my thinking. But we have this colonial, all the contradictions of colonisation, and we need to talk about it and acknowledge it, and we need to recognise that we're not just. I know that my Indigenous friends network widely all over the world. You know, they have amazing networks around the world, but the rest of us who are working on these issues, we need to lift our head up and have a look, and we need to listen to and support what you're going through, because fascism anywhere has to be resisted, because it's you know, the world is both huge and extremely small, and things spread like wildfire, and we see that. You know, like the Leicester incident shows you that this is not just people watching from afar and going, I believe that. This is people acting out of the manipulation of hate against their own neighbours. So, you know, we need to stand with you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. And together, hopefully, we can build this notion of progressive collectives that are anchored in manakitanga, respect for papatuanuku.
Yeah. We just need to listen to what tangata whenua is saying, and I mean, you could say who, because of course there's no one view on anything. We're not talking about a monolithic worldview at all, but there are clear enough messages, and there's a tikanga message about we need to, as others have said to me, you'll never be Māori, so don't even try, but just be the best Pākehā you can be. And I think, well, that's the challenge. That's the challenge. We need to be the best, whatever, however we self-identify that we can be, in order to be useful to a progressive collective society where, you know, where we can actually see our children and grandchildren have something to inherit, some very positive values. And some clean water would be good. Too many cows.
Thank you so much for this lovely conversation, Catherine. It's been such a delight to learn from you and to dialogue, and what a way to spend our decadal anniversary and really think through the kinds of questions you lay for us as we try to imagine what do the next 5 years look for us.
Absolutely, and I'd just like to acknowledge the people who've been, since Sue Bradford, in the last 10 years, who've been in this relationship with care, and to acknowledge them, because, as well as yourselves, because they, many of them pay prices for their activism. And for those of us who, no matter how tenacious and determined we are, to be acknowledged by people like yourselves really helps us. It helps us feel valuable, and it helps us be stimulated to critical reflection, and it makes us feel part of something bigger than ourselves. And we need that. So thank you. Ngā mihi nui. And we need that. So thank you. Ngā mihi nui.